captain. I had met him in my first assignment in the Army, and he was a Reformed Jew who would come into the chapel and absolutely refuse to wear a kippah. And that was his right in the Army, because you could not force a person to do anything that was against their religious beliefs. So he heard me mention that we didn't have a Sefer Torah in Vietnam, and he wrote to his Reform rabbi, who sent him a paper Torah. So he asked me if I could take a picture for his Reform rabbi, and I said, certainly, but you must wear a kippah. He said, but I must have one without for him. I said, fair enough, we'll take two, and I'll use mine to blackmail you, right? He became a faithful attender at services when he was not out on operations. And the last Friday night I was in Vietnam, when he showed up from a field operation with a Viet Cong flag that he had captured as a gift for me, he walked in with a kippah. He used to come to classes and learn Torah, so you never know. The fellow behind the little Sefer Torah, and by the way, we did get a proper kosher Torah. I arranged for that. Fellow behind him was called to the Torah one Shabbat. When we finally grew to a minyan, after weeks of trying to build up a minyan on Shabbat morning, because my predecessor, who was Reform, didn't try, he said, I can't get anybody. And my attitude was that if I get one person, there's going to be tefillah and there's going to be limud, learning. In any case, we called him to the Torah. He didn't know how to read Hebrew. He said, I've never been called to the Torah before. I said, so this is your this is your bar mitzvah then. And then I explained that he was automatically bar mitzvah when he reached the age of mitzvot. I'm not going to go into the other fellows. Okay, this was outside of the chapel, soldiers talking to me before tefillah, right? This was a picture that I shot and ran on the Saigon black market. I don't know, you probably can't make it out, it's somewhat blurred, but kind of in the center, right below the beer cans are rokeach gefilte fish, right, on the black market. All of this was earmarked for my office. I have a chapter in here, or maybe more than one, on in matters of supply. Big problem. Ordered wine because we were down to 2 bottles for the whole country, or 3 bottles for the whole country. 3 Jewish chaplains. Requisition after requisition. I heard that some wine had come into the port. I got a priority 1 to pick it up. Priority 1 is only used when you have a division that's being overrun, has no ammunition, no food. It was signed off by a general, so when it was hand carried to the port and the colonel yelled at our using a priority 1, I said, go yell at the general. 50 cases of wine. A week later, I get a phone call that some wine had come into the country. I said, how much? They said, about 50 cases. I said, all right, deliver it to my compound. I had an office in a supply compound. I said, I can store it here and secure it here. So an hour and a half later, 2 flatbed trucks drove up with 750 cases of kosher wine that had been ordered 2 years earlier. Now I wasn't going to sign for 750. I'd be a ganef for 50 cases. So I called the chief of logistics for all of Vietnam. I said, what should I do with it? He says, can you at least lock it up? I said, I'll lock it up, but I won't assume responsibility. The postscript was, a week later, my original requisition for 12 cases was filled. Another supply snafu, I get a call from an engineer unit once. We have an arc for you. Someone had ordered a welding arc and didn't know how to spell. So they ended up getting a Torah arc, an ARK instead of an ARC. Okay, this is at a MASH hospital, Hanukkah time, making potato latkes, using surgical scalpels to peel the potatoes and surgical saws to grate the potatoes. And you see the soldiers don't mind doing KP there. Right? We commandeered a field stove and proper utensils. They look pretty good. No one complained about them. They tasted good too. Right? This particular tent and this particular sign were put up there by a sergeant whose permanent job in his unit was scrounger. Meaning, if the unit needed certain supplies, he went and he found them. I won't tell you how he found some of these supplies. His name was Sergeant Cristiano. And he arranged for this to be the only purely Jewish chapel in all of Vietnam. It was a field location. And the Magen David was made out of ammunition crates. It's now sitting in the Chaplain Museum. I took it from Vietnam. And this obviously was daytime. We were going through the motions of lighting the candles. And you notice the kippot have the word Vietnam on it. That happened as a result of our running short of kippot on Rosh Hashanah that previous year, well, earlier in the year. And I had an idea to have a Chinese tailor, Buddhist tailor, fashion some kippot and embroider the word Vietnam in Yiddish. And that became a very important souvenir for soldiers. The shulchan is also made out of ammunition crates.
How do you spell Vietnam?
Well, the way it was spelled, Vav Vav Yud Nun. Ayin. I'll show you in a second. I'll show you in a second. Okay, and this was in a chapel, and I'm going to conclude the slide portion with this. This was in a chapel that soldiers built in a field unit with a wing for Jewish prayer, right? I came out to this division headquarters once, totally unaware that they had done this, and it was just a magnificent thing, built by non-Jewish soldiers for Jewish worship. I believe that's the last slide. You asked about the kippot. In every war and in every generation, I think there have been chaplains that have tried to be creative and do something new. So I thought I was the first chaplain, and maybe I was, to have a field yarmulke made out of our fatigue green and a camouflage yarmulke. There was another Jewish chaplain who was in Lebanon when the terrible bombing took place, an American naval chaplain who had one made. And there were chaplains in other eras like the first Iraqi war that had one made. I will tell you, we had a general in Panama who was a very tough man, but we had a great relationship. He was somewhat mishuga, and I was told when we arrived in Panama that I better be prepared when I paid my entrance call on him to know about a special program he had called the Circle U program. The name of the Southern Command headquarters was USARSO, and he made a logo which was an OU logo. So when I paid the call, actually I prepared myself once I heard this. I happened to have had a couple of Jewish papers that had advertisements for OU Kashrus, which said, "Your sign of preparedness." So when I was ushered into the general's office, after the amenities of saluting and how are you and welcome, he says, "Tell me, Rabbi, what do you know about my Circle U program?" I said, "General, I don't know much about your program, but do I have a program for you?" And with that, I showed him some of these things and explained what the OU was. Well, he had monthly meetings to evaluate his program, which was meant to foster certain senses of responsibility in soldiers so that they wouldn't do careless things, both in terms of interpersonal kinds of things and in terms of how they took care of equipment. So at the first meeting, they went around the table at the end of the briefing to see what effect his program had been having. And you know, in the Army, they have charts and slides and statistics and all kinds of things. So as a junior officer at the time, I was one of the last people to be called upon. And he said to me, "Rabbi, tell me what you have to say about my program." I said, "General, I haven't noticed much effect since I've been here, except in one area." I said, "I noticed that the sale of Heinz ketchup tripled in the commissary since I've been here, brought the place down, and we developed a relationship coming from that." When I left Panama, he said, "What can I give you as a souvenir?" I said, "I want stationery that read Office of the Commanding General with the OU on it." Now, I'm not going to go into the halachic issue as to whether or not a non-Jew can come to a Seder, but it was mikubal in the military for senior officers to be invited to the Siddurim. And he came, and when he came, I handed him this kippah that I had made, which he wore throughout the Seder. I asked for it back afterwards. And here is the Vietnam yarmulke, which we spelled Vav Vav Yud Ayin Tet Nun Aleph Mem Sofit. Okay, so much for the kippot. I said I wanted to read something, so I'm going to only read one thing because I don't want to keep you too late. I can go on for hours, and that's not really fair. But I mentioned Yom Kippur at Vietnam, and I showed you the pictures of Yom Kippur at Vietnam. There was a reporter from the New York Post by the name of Barry Cunningham that later on went on to become a television correspondent. And he asked to interview me about the high holidays. And then he asked if he could come to services. And then he wrote what turned out to be a very dramatic story. And I'll read at least part of it. It appeared on September 24th in the New York Post, entitled Yom Kippur at the Viet Front. And I'm quoting now, Tan Son Nhut, Vietnam, the destinies of more than 2,000 Jewish soldiers were sealed in the Book of Life tonight as twilight over Vietnam ushered in the holiest day of the Jewish year. Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, was celebrated here by over 500 soldiers arriving from jungle war zones by helicopter, by truck convoy, by hook or crook. Other services were held in Da Nang and Pleiku. The men's faces were somber as they stacked their M16 rifles in the pews of the Tan Son Nhut Chapel and donned prayer shawls. Did you see a rifle in the chapel? There were no rifles in the chapel. They were all put in a room secure. They came in sweat-soaked fatigues and mud-splattered boots. They already had showers by the time they came into the chapel. Many brought their war wounds with them and had trouble fitting their skull caps on heads already covered with gauze. One fellow did have a big bandage on his head. He fell in his base camp area, had some stitches. Then he talks about me, one of 3 Jewish chaplains, cradling a photostat copy Torah, part of a collapsible army synagogue kit he regularly carries to the field for frontline Sabbaths. First of all, I didn't go to the field on Shabbat. I stayed in Saigon or in a major location where we had our largest concentrations of troops. I went to the field during the week, 3 to 4 days, made over 350 flights to locations to conduct services and education and counseling in the field. And then he goes on to describe some of the other things I did. And then he says, he quotes, things were made poignant with the prayer on Rosh Hashanah, their destiny is inscribed, in Yom Kippur it's sealed. These are all things I explained to him in my room. The white skull caps were in short supply because of the unexpected numbers of worshipers, and local seamstresses were hastily summoned to sew together new ones. The first Vietnamese yarmulkes in history, announced Rabbi Greenspan. Before services began at dusk, he stood outside chatting with the first handful of GIs to be greeted from the field. 2 men were killed by sniper fire on the cargo plane that brought, and he names 2 people, to this Sabbath of Sabbaths. It never happened. I got letters from Jewish mothers after reading this in the New York Post telling me to tell their sons not to come to services, it's too dangerous. And it was. It was a war zone, and it was dangerous in their base camps. And I'd write back and say, it may be dangerous, but if you knew what your soldiers were getting out of coming to services, then you would not ask me to tell them not to come. One time, a vehicle that was bringing soldiers in Friday had the vehicle behind it blown up. I arranged in my room in Saigon to sleep 10 people every Friday night who came in from the field and stayed for Shabbat. They tried to take that room away from me exclusively and make it into a room for 3 officers, and I lodged a formal complaint. They also objected to the fact that I was having enlisted soldiers sleeping in an officer's billet, and when I argued that I needed a privacy for prayer, we continued having the room available, and 10 soldiers came. And then he talks about some soldiers, and he mentions names, who brought their anxieties over war. And he quotes me, and this I never said. Biblically, Greenspan told them, men of God fought wars. Moses was not only a man of peace, he had to fight battles. Why are we here, asked Stein. A Jew in Vietnam is what he has always been, said the rabbi. A fighter and a champion of the rights of man. Whose side is God on? And here he quotes me as saying, God judges all mankind, said Greenspan. We feel that God's on our side, and I believe it. And this went on and on and on. I never had these conversations with soldiers. I had conversations similar to this. Clearly, not conversations that he heard. And then he talks about our cantor, who was a soldier who acted as a Baal Tefillah. Hear, O Israel, he intoned in Hebrew. He hesitated until the ear-splitting roar of a fighter jet droned over the horizon. The Lord our God, the Lord is one. The men began their fast. It will end at sundown tomorrow with bagels and salami provided by the Jewish Welfare Board. They will weep at Yizkor, the memorial prayer for the souls of Jewish soldiers who have fallen in the war. They will beat their chests as a sign of confession. And tomorrow at sundown, as the ram's horn sounds a solitary note over the bleak runways and the Quonset huts of Tan Son Nhut Air Force Base, the celestial book of accounts will close. The men will return to war. A very dramatic story. Many stories like this. I take the press to account in many things. I write about a transcontinental Brit. One of the things I felt was important in transmitting Judaism was humor. If you could do unique and humorous things, you could sometimes get soldiers motivated and involved with religion. So I got a call from a soldier on the Atlantic side of the Isthmus of Panama. His wife had a baby and he needed a Brit. And I had learned Mila for emergencies. And it was a Friday, so I called the Air Force and asked them if they could give me a plane to fly me over there, because I didn't feel like spending 3 to 4 hours traveling round trip. And they agreed. Flying time was about 10 minutes. As soon as you got up in the air, you saw the Atlantic Ocean. That's how close the Pacific and the Atlantic are, about 50 miles from one another. And so I wrote that up for JWB, Jewish Welfare Board, as what I thought to be the first transcontinental Brit in history, but clearly it was the first one that took only 15 minutes to get from one coast to the other on. I mean, all kinds of things like that. I've highlighted things here. And by the way, I did prepare some tables of contents. I mentioned to you about Operation Bagel. I had experiences that never would have happened, I think, in other worlds. A Jewish congressman came over to Vietnam, a fellow by the name of Joe Resnick.